to Watchmen on the Pod. All right. I wanted to read out of the Holy War. It's only going to be a couple of chapters. I said I was going to read, and I want to make sure that I do exactly what I say. All right. It is the Holy War made by Shaddai upon Diablos for the regaining of the metropolis of the world by John Bunyan, who, oh, it stopped for a minute. He's the author of Pilgrim's Progress. Chapter 19. Deceived by carnal security. But after the prince bestowed all of this mercy, a man in the town of Mansoul by the name of Mr. Carnal Security brought Mansoul into great and severe slavery and bondage. Let me offer you a brief account about him and his doings to give you a better understanding of what happened. When Diablos first took possession of the town of Mansoul, he brought with him a great number of Diablins. These men all shared in his sinful condition, and among them was a man by the name of Mr. Self-Conceit. He who trusts in his own heart is a fool. Proverbs chapter 28, verse 26a. He was a notable man, with as bold an attitude as anyone who possessed the town of Mansoul in those days. Diablos recognized that this man was active and bold and used him in many wretched plans, which he happened to manage better than most who came with him from the dens. This pleased Diablos, his lord, very much. Therefore, since he found him suited for his purpose, he preferred him over the others and ranked him next to the great Lord Wilbewill. Now, Lord Wilbewill was pleased with him and his achievements in those days, so he gave him his daughter, the Lady Fear Nothing, as his wife. God will hear, let's see, what's that say? God will hear and answer them, even the one who sits enthroned from of old, with whom there is no change, and who do not fear God. Psalm 55, verse 19. Together, Lady Fear Nothing and Mr. Self-Conceit conceived a child who grew to be this gentleman, Mr. Carnal Security. Behold, the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the obedience of his riches and was strong in his evil desires. Psalm chapter 52, verse 7. With these kinds of relationships, it was hard in cases like this to determine who were natives of Mansoul and who were not. For Mr. Carnal Security sprang from Lord Wilbewill on his mother's side, but his father was a Diablin by nature. Well, Carnal Security tended to take after his father and mother. He proved to be conceited, feared nothing, and was a very busy man. No news or doctrine, no changes or even talk of changes circulated about in man's soul unless carnal security was at the beginning or end of it. To be sure he controlled things, he shunned those who he deemed the weakest and always stood with those moving in his direction whom he supposed to be the strongest. Now, when the mighty Shaddai and Emmanuel his son made war upon Mansoul to take it, this carnal security was in town at that time. As a great doer among the people, he encouraged them in the rebellion. He took advantage of their good nature and encouraged them to harden themselves in resisting the king's forces. When he saw the town of Mansoul was taken and converted to the purposes of the glorious Prince Emmanuel, and then saw what became of Diablos when he was uprooted and forced to leave the castle amid much contempt and scorn, he slyly made a turnabout. He pretended he would serve the prince against his foes in the same way that he had served Diablos. After acquiring a smattering of Emmanuel's things, being the bold sort, he ventured amid the townsmen and attempted to strike up a chat among them. He knew the power and strength of the town of Mansoul was great, and he knew it would please the people if he talked up their might and glory. Therefore, he began his tale by talking about the power and strength of Mansoul. He declared it to be impregnable and talked about the greatness of their captains, their slings, and their rams, and boasted about their fortifications and strongholds. Lastly, he mentioned the assurances they had from their prince that Mansoul would be happy forever. Surely goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Psalm 23:6. When he saw that some of the men of the town were entertained and interested in his discourse, he made it his business to walk from street to street, house to house, and man to man to talk. Finally, he led man's soul while playing the flute as they danced. It felt good and right, and as they danced, they grew almost as carnally secure as he was. And this was only the beginning. For they moved on from talking to feasting, and from feasting to amusing themselves and making merry. So they followed their appetites in these ways and other matters. Emmanuel was still in the town of Mansoul, and he observed their behavior. Lord Mayor, Lord Wilby-Will, and Mr. Recorder were also captivated with the words of this idle-talking diablin gentleman. For there are many rebellious men, empty talkers, and deceivers. Titus chapter 1, verse 10. But they forgot their prince had warned them to take care not to be misled or deluded with any diablin sly trick. He had told them the security of the now flourishing town of Mansoul didn't lie so much in her present fortifications and strength, but in how she used what she had that might oblige her Emmanuel to abide within her castle. For the true doctrine of Emmanuel was the town of Mansoul should take care not to forget his Father's love and his love, and that they should humbly continue in that love. What they were doing now was not the way to do it. They had fallen in love with one of the diablins who were being led by the nose by such a one as Mr. Colonel Security. They should have listened to their prince and responded in fear and love. They should have stoned this naughty pack of diablin followers to death and taken care to walk in the ways of their prince. For if they had done so, they would be enjoying peace like a river and your righteousness like the waves of the sea. Isaiah chapter 48, verse 18. Now it was apparent to Emmanuel that the policy of carnal security chilled the hearts of the men of Mansoul and diminished their practical love for him. He mourned for them and grieved their condition with the secretary, as he said, "Oh, that my people had listened to me." And Mansoul, let's see, did I skip a page? Hold on 1 minute. I just turned the page. Oh, that my people had listened to me, and Mansoul had walked in my ways. I would have sustained them with the finest of wheat and with honey out of the rock. With this done, he said in his heart, I will return to the court, to my place, until Mansoul considers what they have done and acknowledges their offenses. And he returned to his father's court, because Mansoul's relationship with him reflected that it had waned in a number of ways. 1. They broke fellowship with him and no longer visited him or came to his royal palace. 2. They didn't regard or take notice that he no longer came to visit them. 3. Though he continued to hold love feasts between their prince and them as was the custom, they neglected to do them or be delighted with them. 4. They no longer waited for his guidance, but became headstrong. They considered themselves strong and invincible, and thought Mansoul secure. They thought Mansoul was beyond all reach of the enemy, and her state would be unalterable forever. Now, as was said, Emmanuel noticed that through Mr. Colonel Security's craftiness, the town of Mansoul no longer depended upon him or his father, and so he put in place what was bestowed upon it. First, he mourned their state. Then he implemented measures to make them understand the way they were following was dangerous. He sent the Lord High Secretary to forbid them to follow such ways, but twice when the secretary came to them, he found them at dinner in Colonel Security's parlor, satiating with appetites with his delights. He recognized they weren't willing to reason about matters concerning their good. It grieved him, and he went his way. When he told Prince Emmanuel what had happened, or what had transpired, he took offense and was grieved too. So he made pre-arrangements to return to his father's court. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Genesis chapter 6, verse 3. Even while he was still with them in Mansoul, he stayed secluded and more withdrawn than before. Mansell no longer perceived his speech to be as pleasant and familiar when he came into their company. Plus, he no longer sent dainty bits from his table as he had been accustomed to doing in the past. If they came to his gate, they might knock once or twice, but he didn't seem to regard them, whereas in the past he would run to meet them halfway at the sound of their approach, invite them in, and hold them close. Now, when they came to visit him, they found he wasn't so easily spoken with as in the past. For now, Emmanuel tolerated it and sought to make them reflect on all that had transpired in hopes they would return to him with their hearts. But alas, they didn't consider or regard his ways because the changes in their relationship with him didn't bother them. They didn't really think about the prince's former favors. As a result, he withdrew, first from his palace, then he moved to the gate of the town, and finally he moved away from Mansoul, waiting for them to acknowledge their offense and earnestly seek his face. Mr. God's peace also laid down his commission, and for the time being no longer exerted his influence in the town of Mansoul. Thus Mansoul walked contrary to his ways, and he, by way of reprisal, walked in an opposite direction from them. Do two men walk together unless they have made an appointment? Amos 3:3. Well, that's totally different from the 16:11. I think it's, can two men walk together lest they be agreed? But unfortunately, by this time, they were hardened, obstinate, and set in their ways because they had swallowed so much of carnal security's doctrine. So when their prince departed, it didn't bother them in the least. They didn't even think of him once. He was gone. So his absence didn't grieve them in even a little. That is sad. Now we're going to part 2, guys. And this is chapter 20. Hello. Oh, the dog will start barking. Forgive me. All right, here we go. Now a day arrived when this old gentleman, carnal security, prepared a feast for the town of Mansoul. At that time, Mr. Godly Fear was in town. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Psalm 111, verse 10a. In times past, his presence was requested, but now he was asked to participate very little. Old Colonel Security had a plan in mind. If possible, his idea was to mislead this man and deceive him as he had all the rest. So he invited Godly Fear to the feast with his neighbors. When all the preparations had been made, Godly Fear arrived with the rest of the guests. All were seated at the table and served food and drink. They feasted and made merry, all except for this one man. Godly Fear sat like a stranger among the crowd. He didn't eat or make merry. When Colonel Security saw this, he went over to talk with the man. He said, "Mr. Godly Fear, are you not well? You seem to be mentally or physically ill, or perhaps both. I have a medicine, crafted by Mr. Forgetgood, which gives his life and cheerfulness to a person. It raises the spirits of one who is weak and depressed. Try a sip, for I hope it will make you merry and carefree, and more fit as a feasting companion to us. Godly Fear discreetly replied, "Sir, I thank you for all things courteous and civil, but for your cordial, I have no desire to imbibe. However, I do have a word for the natives of Mansoul, you, the elders, and important citizens of Mansoul. It is strange to see you so lively and merry when the town of Mansoul is in such a miserable situation." Colonel Security tried to dismiss Godly Fear's statement. "I believe you need sleep. I offer you a comfortable room. Please go lie down and take a nap, and in the meantime, we will be merry." Godly Fear looked directly at Colonel Security and said, "Sir, if you had an honest heart, you couldn't do what you have done and continue to do it." "Why not?" Colonel Security shrugged. Don't interrupt me, Godly Fear scolded. It's true the town of man's soul was strong, and with a conditional stipulation that affects the agreement with Shaddai, it was impregnable. But you townsmen have weakened our famous town. Man's soul now lies accountable to its enemies. It's not the time to either flatter or be silent. Godly Fear gestured toward Colonel Security. You have stripped man's soul and driven her glory from her. You pulled down her towers, broken down her gates, and rendered the security of her locks and bars useless. To make it clear what I mean, from the time you, sir, and your lords of man's soul have grown so great, the strength of man's soul, the strength of man's soul has been offended. He has risen and is gone. If anyone wants to question the truth of my words, I ask this: where is the Prince Emmanuel? When's the last time a man or woman in man's soul saw him? When did you last hear from him or taste any of his dainty bits? You now feast with this diabling monster, but he is not your prince. But these will, in the destruction of their creatures, also be destroyed. They are stains and blemishes, revelings in their deceits or deceptions, as they carouse with you, forsaking the right way. They have gone astray. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 12 through 15. If you had paid attention to enemies outside your walls to make sure they did not breach our walls, they could not have made a prey of you. But since you have sinned against your prince, your enemies are now within and have been too hard for you. Cardinal Security waved a dismissive hand towards Godly Fear. Bah! Godly Fear, you will never shake off your fearfulness and lack of courage. Are you afraid of being dumbfounded? Who has hurt you? He tipped his head to the side, feigning sincerity. Look, I'm on your side, but you doubt, while I am confident. He shrugged with his palms toward the ceiling. Besides, is this a time to be sad? A feast is made for laughter. So why, to your shame and our trouble, do you break into such depressive language when you should be eating, drinking, and being merry? Godly Fear let out a long sigh. I am sad because Emmanuel has gone from man's soul. Do you hear me? I said he is gone, and you, sir, are the man who drove him away. He is gone without so much as giving notice to the nobles of man's soul that he was leaving. If that's not a sign of his anger, then I'm not familiar with godly nature. And now, my lords and gentlemen, for I am still speaking to you, your gradual dropping away from fellowship with him provoked him to slowly depart from you. He's been doing so for some time. Perhaps if you had noticed, had come to your senses, and had renewed your standing with him by humbling yourselves. Sadness glistened in Godly Fear's eyes when he saw no one noticed these dreadful early stages of his anger and judgment, nor took them to heart. He went away from this place. I saw this with my own eyes. Therefore, now, while you boast, your strength is gone. You're like the man who lost his shoulder-length locks while he slept, and with them his strength. She made him sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his hair. Then she began to afflict him, and his strength left him. Judges chapter 16, verse 19. You may, with this lord of your feast, shake yourselves awake and think you can do everything as you did before. However, he has departed from you, and without him you can do nothing. So turn your feast into mourning and your laughter into weeping. These words startled the secondary preacher, Mr. Conscience, who was the old recorder of man's soul. He said, My brothers, I'm afraid what Godly Fear tells us is true. I, for my part, haven't seen my prince for a long time. I can't even remember the last time. I can't answer Godly Fear's question. I'm afraid all is dire with man's soul. Godly Fear agreed. I know you won't find him in man's soul, for he is gone because of the elders' inattention and lack of wisdom in their actions, for they rewarded his grace with intolerable unkindness. Mr. Conscience grew pale and looked ready to fall down dead at the table, and he wasn't the only one. All those at the feast, except for Colonel Security, began to turn an ashen hue. Now Colonel Security disliked such depressing goings-on and withdrew into a room beside the feasting hall. Those who had heard Godly Fear speak recovered a little, and together agreed to believe what he had said. They consulted as to how best to act, both in regard to the man of the house for drawing them into evil, and also to regain Emmanuel's love. As they said this, they recalled what their prince had told them to do when such false prophets arose among them to delude the town of Mansoul. Under the conviction of those words burning within them, they concluded Colonel Security was a false prophet, and thus burned his house down upon him with fire, for he was a diablin by nature. But the prophet who speaks a word presumptuously in my name, which I had not commanded him to speak, or which he speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 20. Then they decided to look for Emmanuel the prince. They sought him, but did not find him. This confirmed the truth of what Godly Fear had said, and it caused them to judge themselves and reflect upon the vile and ungodly things they had done. They realized that it was because of them that their prince had left. They agreed to go see the Lord Secretary, whom they had refused to hear from and whom they had grieved with their actions. He was a seer, and they wanted to ask him if he could tell them where Emmanuel was and how they might send a petition to him. But the Lord Secretary wouldn't admit them to discuss this matter, nor would he allow them to enter his royal abode. He didn't even show his face to them, inform them, or instruct them. Gloomy clouds hung like a thick blanket of darkness upon Mansoul, and they saw they had been foolish. For the first time they perceived the wretched damage Colonel Security's companionship, swaggering words, and continual idle chatter had brought upon poor Mansoul. They thought about what further cost they would have to pay. With these thoughts milling about in their minds, the men of the town of Mansoul once again looked at Godly Fear as one of good reputation. They were ready to consider him a prophet. When the Sabbath day came, they went to hear their secondary preacher, Mr. Conscience. His sermon was fearsomely filled with thunder and lightning. His text was found in the book of the prophet Jonah. Those who regard vain idols forsake their faithfulness. Jonah chapter 2, verse 8. He preached with such power and authority that the countenance of the people fell that day. The message was unlike what they had usually heard or saw. By the time the sermon concluded, the people were scarcely able to go to their homes or to work the following week. The sermon made such an impact on them they didn't know what to do. In the sermon, Mr. Conscience didn't only show Mansoul their sin, but he also trembled before them because of the sense of his own sin. So he cried out for himself as he preached to them, "Unhappy man that I am, that I should do so wicked a thing, that I, a preacher whom the prince set up to teach Mansoul his law, should myself live senselessly and without reason, and be one of the first found in transgression. This transgression occurred within my precinct. I should have cried out against the wickedness, but I let Mansoul wallow in it until it drove Emmanuel from its borders." He also charged all the lords and nobility of Mansoul with these same things. About this time a great sickness fell upon the town of Mansoul, and most of the inhabitants were afflicted. This included the captains and men of war too. They languished in this condition for a long time. It was serious enough that if an invasion took place, nothing of consequence could be done by either the townsmen or the field officers. The faces of the people everywhere were pale, and their hands weak. With shaky knees, men staggered on the streets of Mansoul amid groans and pants, and in the distance more were ready to faint. So also I will make you sick, striking you down, desolating you because of your sins. You will eat, but you will not be satisfied. Micah chapter 6, verse 13 and 14. They still wore the garments Emmanuel had given them. but they were in a sorry state. Some had holes, others were torn, but all were in a nasty condition. Some no longer fit and hung so loosely on them that if they had got snagged upon a bush, they would be plucked from them and leave them naked. After they spent some time in this sad, bleak condition, the secondary preacher, Mr. Conscience, called for a day of fasting and prompted the people to humble themselves for being so wicked against the great Shaddai and his son. And he desired that Captain Borginis would preach, and he agreed to do it. When the day arrived, his message was based upon this text: cut it down. Why should it even waste the soil? And he began telling this parable. A man had a fig tree which had been planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and did not find any. And he said to the vineyard keeper, behold, for 3 years I have come looking for fruit on this tree without finding any. Cut it down. Why does it even use up the ground? Luke chapter 13, 6 through 7. He delivered a vivacious sermon which first showed his reason for choosing this text, namely that the fig tree was barren. Then he followed this by showing what else was contained in the text, specifically a choice between repentance or utter desolation. He showed them it was by Shaddai's authority that this sentence was pronounced. Lastly, he presented reasons that supported his point, and then he concluded his sermon. What he had to say to man's soul was relevant in the application so much that poor man's soul trembled. For this sermon, as well as the former sermon, worked upon the hearts of the men of man's soul. It helped to keep those awake who were roused by the prior preaching, and as a result, sorrow, mourning, and woe could be heard throughout the whole town. After the sermon, the town gathered to talk about the best thing they could do. Mr. Conscience spoke up and said, I will do nothing based on my own decisions without talking it over with my neighbor, Godly Fear. For he provided more understanding of the mind of our prince than we did, and I don't know for sure, but I think he may have the same insight now as we are turning again to moral goodness. So they sent for Godly Fear, and he appeared immediately. Upon his arrival, they made known their desire for him to reveal his feelings about what was best for them to do. The old gentleman answered directly, it is my opinion that this town of Mansoul should, in this day of her distress, draw up and send a humble petition to their offended Prince Emmanuel, so that he, in his favor and grace, will turn again to you and not stay angry forever. For the needy will not always be forgotten, nor the hope of the afflicted perish forever. Psalm chapter 9, verse 18. When the townsmen heard this, they agreed as one to his advice and drew up the request. Then they had to decide who should carry it to the prince. They agreed to send it by the hand of the Lord Mayor, understanding, and he accepted the opportunity to serve in this way. He committed himself to his journey, departed, and arrived at the gate of the court of Shaddai, where Emmanuel the Prince of Mansoul had gone. But the gate was shut, and a vigilant guard kept watch there. So the petitioner was forced to stand outside the gate for a great while. He made it known to some that he desired the prince be told who stood at the gate and what his business was. Finally, someone agreed to do so, and went in and told Shaddai and Emmanuel his son that the Lord Mayor of the town of Mansoul stood outside the gate of the king's court, desiring to be admitted into the presence of the prince, the king's son. The messenger explained the reason for the Lord Mayor's errand, both to the king and to his son Emmanuel. However, the prince would not come to the gate or agree that the gate should be opened to him. Instead, he sent his answer. They have turned their back to me and not their face. How's that worded? They have turned their back to me and not their face, and now in the time of their trouble they say to me, arise and save us. Why don't they go to Mr. Colonel's security, as they did when they turned from me, and make him their leader, their Lord, and their protection now in their trouble? Is this in their prosperity they went astray? Why is it that in their trouble they visit me? Wow. With this answer, the Lord Mayor's face turned a dark purple, for it not only troubled and perplexed him, but also caused him to grieve. He saw again the consequences of being familiar with Diabolins, such as Mr. Colonel Security. When he looked toward the court, he understood little help could be expected for himself or his friends in Mansoul. He humbly struck his breast and returned weeping and grieving over the deplorable state of Mansoul the entire way. When he came within the sight of the town, the elders and leading people of Mansoul went out at the gate to meet him and learn how he fared at court. With a downcast countenance, he told them his tale, and they all cried out, mourned, and wept at the news. They responded with humility by throwing ashes and dust upon their heads and dressing their loins in sackcloth. In this manner they went crying throughout the town of Mansoul. For this, put on sackcloth, lament, and wail, for the fierce anger of the Lord has not turned back from us. Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 8. When the rest of the townsfolk saw this, they too mourned and wept, and thus it was a day of rebuke, trouble, and anguish for the town of Mansoul, a day of great distress. After some time, when they had somewhat renounced their ways, they came together to consult again about the best thing for them to do. They asked advice, as they did before, from the Reverend Godly Fear, who told them, there is no way better than to do as you did before. He went on to tell them they should not be discouraged at all by the treatment they met with at court previously, even if several of their petitions should be answered with nothing but silence or a reprimand. For it is the way of the wise Shaddai to make men wait and exercise patience, and it should be the way of those who fall short to be willing to wait for his timing. Behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope for his loving kindness. Psalm chapter 33, verse 18. They took courage from his words and sent petitions again and again and again and again. Not a day or hour went by in Mansoul in which a man didn't meet another upon the road who was sounding the horn from Mansoul to the court of the king Shaddai and delivering letters petitioning the prince's return to Mansoul. Yes, the road filled with messengers meeting in their comings and goings. Some traveled from the court and some from Mansoul. All this was the work of the miserable town of Mansoul during that long, harsh, cold, and tedious winter. Let me see how long chapter this one is, and I might go ahead and read it. Hold on 1 minute, guys. If it's too long, I can't, because I might have to get up very early and take my sister in. Yeah, it's too long. So, until next time, brothers and sisters, keep your eyes on Jesus and your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And let us embed the Word of God upon the tablets of our hearts, so we will not sin against God or be deceived. You have a good evening. Good night.